Well, good morning, everyone. Oh, no, I can't hear anyone. Good morning, everyone. There we go. Last night, there was a late game between University of Richmond and VCU at the Robbins Center. And so I'm awake. But I want to welcome you all to this presentation this morning. For the last 3 or 4 days now, we've had a number of experts and advisors, those who have experience in land use issues from all around the country here as part of the Rose Fellowship in conjunction with the National League of Cities and the Urban Land Institute. And I've been fortunate enough to be selected as one of the 4 mayors from around the country to join this prestigious organization's opportunity to take a look at Richmond and some of the challenges we may have, but also take a look at all the opportunities that lie before our great city. I'm not going to stand up here and talk very long, but you all know how I feel about the area of the Shockoe Valley footprint and how, although there may be some challenges, how they could be an opportunity for not only for Shockoe Bottom, but for the great city of Richmond to have an opportunity to remember and honor the enslaved Africans who built this city once and for all, and also bring the vibrancy we see throughout our city right here to Shockoe Bottom as well. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jess Zimbabwe, who is the director of the Rose Center for Public Leadership. Jess, take it away.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Mayor Stoney and all of your team. These are the folks that are part of the Richmond team and who've made this visit this week possible and spent a lot of time making us feel very comfortable, as did many of you who spent time with us and gave us your candid insights to help us deliver some preliminary observations and recommendations this week. So I'm just here to introduce the team of experts we have in from around the country and to tell you a little bit about what we've done this week and what it's a part of. So we're here in Richmond, Virginia, as you know, and what we're talking about, we've been talking about the last few days, is a shared vision for Shockoe Bottom. We're here as a part of the Rose Center for Public Leadership, which was founded by a major gift from this gentleman, Daniel Rose, who's a real estate developer out of New York. And Mr. Rose, looking back on his successful career in real estate, realized it was only possible because of the partnerships he had with the cities that he was building in and the folks representing those cities. And that too frequently, the relationship between the public and the private sector are boiled down to that negotiating table of a development approval process, and that they're unnecessarily antagonistic. And in fact, the public and the private sectors could come together and have a more fruitful conversation about better futures for cities. So he wanted to create the space for that, to have the expertise of the private sector put into the service of the challenges that cities face. So that's what we're here to try to do in the Rose Center. So as you noticed from our logo at the bottom, the Rose Center is operated as a partnership between 2 nonprofit organizations. The first alphabetically is the National League of Cities, which is an association of local governments working on behalf of 19,000 cities, towns, and villages across the US, helping cities leaders build better communities. And the second nonprofit organization is the Urban Land Institute, which is an organization supported by some 40,000 individual members in the real estate and related industries who've committed themselves to a mission here of providing leadership in the responsible use of land and in building thriving communities. So the Rose Center does a few other things, forums to bring together thought leadership from the public and the private sectors. We do educational programming. We provide scholarships to allow public officials to participate in really important conversations in real estate and other industries. But the flagship program is what we're here as a part of, and that's the Daniel Rose Fellowship. It's a year-long program, and we select 4 large cities across the US each year to participate in a year-long program of leadership training, professional development, and assistance on a local land use challenge that each city selects. So the mayor is a fellow, and then the mayor selects 3 fellows and a project manager, who you know to be now as the Richmond team here. This is a photograph of this kind of work happening when we work in the city of Honolulu. I include it to let you know that even in Paradise, they have lousy public agency conference rooms and lousy pastries during their meetings. These are the cities that have preceded the current class in our first 8 years of the program. So we've been around the country in 32 cities before this year. And this year, the current class joining Richmond are the cities of Columbus, Ohio, Salt Lake City, Utah, and Tucson, Arizona. We're here this week as a part of an event that happens in the middle of that year fellowship. We call it a peer exchange panel visit, where we assemble a team of experts to study the land use challenge that the city has presented and to provide the city's leadership team with a framework and some initial ideas to start addressing that challenge. So this is the panel of folks that we've convened around the country, and I will introduce them. We have two co-chairs, and I'll get you guys to just raise your hands as I call you out. Co-chairs Andre Brumfield, who's with Gensler in Chicago, excellent, and Colleen Carey, who's with the Cornerstone Group in Minneapolis. Also Karen Abrams with the Heinz Endowments in Pittsburgh, Michael Ackerlow with the Community Development Corporation of Utah to Salt Lake, and Mike is one of the fellows from the Salt Lake City team, so one member of the Richmond team will be advising him in just a few weeks. Lisa Beyer with Alta Planning and Design in Oakland, California, Daniel Bursick with Planning Development Services in the city of Tucson, Arizona. Daniel will also be in the hot seat receiving recommendations in just a couple of weeks. So, Christopher Coase with Locus, Responsible Real Estate Developers out of Washington, D.C., a part of Smoke Growth America. Martine Kambal with JLL out of Washington, D.C. Brian Lee out of Colocate in New Orleans, Louisiana. Federico Maisch, a civil engineer out of Northbrook, Illinois. Brent Sobchak of Castro Communities in Columbus, Ohio. Brent will also be in the receiving end of some recommendations. And Ashley Wilson, who's an architect with the National Trust for Historic Preservation out of Washington. So it's my pleasure to introduce the co-chairs of this panel who will lead the rest of the presentation. Andre, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. I know I'm not the mayor of the city, but I hope for a stronger response. Good morning. Thank you. My name is Andre Brumfield, again from Gensler in Chicago. We just want to jump right into this. We do have quite a bit to go through. And first I want to thank Mayor Stoney, also Councilmember Newble, the mayor's staff, and also the community. We really appreciate the invitation to come into your city, to come into your community, to not, if you will, give solutions to some of the problems or challenges that you're facing, but to really help offer insight and really celebrate what you've already done, because you actually have done a lot here in Shockoe Bottom. And we really think there's a larger opportunity here to tell a national story, building on the spirit that you have here and also the untold stories here in Shockoe Bottom. So just to kind of go over the challenge that we were actually given, the idea of how can Richmond leverage its assets and investments in Shockoe Bottom, everything that's been done to date so far, to create a destination that protects its culture and protects its historic heritage. But the idea of how can you actually build on that and use that as a way to leverage economic opportunities and unlock other economic development. And the idea of this vision, creating a vision, one that's sustainable, one that goes beyond the next 2 years, the next 4 years, the next 10 years, but something that actually the next generations can actually take advantage of and build on and appreciate. So very quickly, because we do have a lot to get to, just want to go over the outline. So we do have some initial observations. We came in, a number of us came in Sunday night and Monday. So we wanted to give you quick first thoughts, if you will, of our impressions. But then also really emphasize the idea of a shared vision. This is something that has to be shared, not just from the mayor, not just from the private sector, not just from the institutions, but also from the community. Everyone has a stake in this. So the idea of actually coming around a shared vision is very important. The idea of a public realm, my colleagues will speak to that, the importance of connectivity, the idea of not just thinking about this in terms of a park or recreation, but also your streets, your public realm. How do you actually, make Shockoe Bottom a place that people come to as opposed to going through or feeling like they can't get there at all? The importance of development and land use, the ideas of how we actually can leverage some development opportunities around that. We also talked about economic opportunity and ways that you can actually unlock the potential there, and the idea of education, not just from the institutions, but also K through 12. What does this mean for the next generation, and how can we actually prepare them through the proper education process? Governance, something else that our team will get into, and last but not least, conclusions, and we always, through at least Rose Center, like to give homework to the powers that be in their city. Mr. Mayor, we're looking at you and your city. So with that, we'll quickly go through some observations and the opportunities that we see. This half-acre site, Devil's Half Acre, offers opportunity to create international cultural destination. And that really is you know, we really see this as a unique story here. You know, there's no place else in the country that really captures the history, captures the experience, and, you know, the idea of how we can actually leverage that, you know, to tell a story that not only, you know, talks about Richmond, but really talks about this as being a complete American story, and the idea of having the complete story, if you will. So Main Street Station, this is a gem. You guys are sitting on a very strong piece of investment here. This is only the beginning, and we all know that this has taken quite some time to get this station to where it is right now. And we want to emphasize that it takes patience here. When you're talking about creating a district, when you're talking about, you know, the idea of establishing something new for a vision, a plan, this is not an 18 to 24 month process. This is a long-term process, and we all have to be in here for the long haul. The idea of Richmond and its neighbors, how do they actually leverage some of this new investment and take advantage of some of the investment that's happening here? You know, there is land that is available for development, but it's not all tied into the largest land, the landowner, if you will. What are some of the other opportunities that we can take advantage of that get beyond just even if this site footprint, where we can actually unlock some of that development potential? We know that you're very passionate about Shockoe Bottom. We see the t-shirts. I like a t-shirt, double X, by the way. I see Safe Shockoe Bottom. I like to take that back to Chicago. You know, the idea of actually, you know, taking advantage of that that passion, that excitement that really comes at the grassroots, that really starts to, you know, capture the community, the essence of the community. That story needs to be told here as well. The idea of partnerships, nearby institutions, the universities, the private entities, but also the community colleges, and of course, the community itself. You have to be a partner in this as well. Clear that you have a very strong mayor, and Mayor, again, we want to thank you. I think this is very bold that you're taking this on. You know, the idea of, you know, establishing a common vision, but also the idea of actually righting a wrong. You know, respecting and understanding the past, you know, understanding what's there on site now, but also the untold stories that yet to be unearthed. And quickly go through some other observations as far as the opportunities. You know, finding a common vision. There's been a lot of things that have been done so far. There's been a lot of things done to date. This is not starting over. This is building on what has been done. But the idea of actually taking collectively all these plans, all these visions, how do you actually streamline that to a single vision where everyone could actually have ownership on this? And more importantly, through that process is building trust. You cannot move forward unless you have trust with each other, that you actually can move forward by understanding your past. The idea of, you know, building on Richmond's history. We talked about telling the complete story, Richmond's complete history. The idea of, you know, how you can actually use this as an exercise, if you will, in a process that really speaks to truth and reconciliation. My dear friend and colleague, Brian Lee, will talk about some of his experiences in New Orleans, some lessons that could be taken from there. But again, this is your story, and this has to be Richmond's story because it's our American story, if you will. The idea of, you know, unearthing Richmond's, or actually the opportunity to define Richmond's future and make it known as really kind of the capital and the hub for reconciliation and for learning. How do you actually revisit your past? Because we really think that's important to really establish that future moving forward. And the idea of, you know, using this as an opportunity to use history and culture as an economic driver. We think you really could be the first in the country to really start to take advantage of your history and how do you actually, you know, turn this into an economic engine. And last but certainly not least, the idea of the public-private philanthropic interest, everyone investing here and having a common vision. But we also should mention the community, a key partner in this partnership. The idea of actually how you actually work together to create that shared vision. So those are some of the observations and the opportunities that we've acknowledged. I'd like to turn to my colleague, Colleen.
Thanks, Andre. So we probably wouldn't be here if there weren't a couple of challenges, and every city has some interesting and gnarly land use challenges, and so we are here to help work through some of that. But like Andre, I feel like you're starting from a really strong base with a great city with lots of assets and lots of amenities and lots of passion and enthusiasm. And we've gotten a chance to talk to maybe 80 or 100 people while we've been here, thanks to all of you who have helped to inform us, because it's challenging to come to a city that you don't know and then try to tackle something complicated in a couple of days. And and offer some recommendations. So we couldn't do that without the help of all of you. Some of you have spent some time talking to us about what I would call your vision for, but those are individual visions for what could happen here. And we all think that one of the things that's missing is a really shared, unified vision for what can happen in the Shockoe Bottom area. So some people out there, some of you are listening to this thinking, oh my gosh, she's talking more process. And so some people are fatigued by the process, but then there are other people who feel like they haven't been heard at all yet. And so there's this challenge of balancing all of that and continuing to do the kinds of process that's necessary to get from here to the outcome that you want while still keeping everybody engaged. Another challenge that you have is that there are private landowners who control big chunks of the area, but they aren't necessarily aligned with a vision or with the city about what's going to happen there. So there's work that needs to be done to align the private landowners, the vision, the city, and that's going to take some time to sort through. Shockoe Bottom is physically cut off from the city, and so in some ways that's a big obstacle that has to be overcome. Some of that can happen with some of the recommendations that we're going to be making today. Land use regulations are fragmented, and that contributes to this sense that the property owners may or may not be on the same page about where the area is going for the future. And acknowledging a painful history is a difficult thing, and it brings up all sorts of topics that aren't necessarily about land use. And so there's a conversation that needs to happen here that isn't about that, and I'll talk about that in a second when we get to a bigger discussion of this shared vision. The floodplain creates some challenges. It's possible to build in a floodplain, but it's expensive and complicated, and so there are questions to be answered about what can happen in that area. This building, as Andre said, it's a marvel. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful amenity, but it is also somewhat disconnected from the rest of the city. And so how do you connect this place, and how do you activate the space? And we have some recommendations about that we think will leverage your investment in this beautiful building. And then, again, related to this building is some uncertainty about its future in terms of being a high-speed rail hub, and when that would happen, and if it would happen, and where the money comes from to make that happen. So those are some of the challenges that we see as we have talked to you and walked around your beautiful city this week. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of shared vision. I think it's one of the most important things that a city can have when they're tackling a complicated issue. And this one is even more complicated because in the process of unearthing this physical evidence of Richmond's role in the slave trade, it's really elevated this question of race and past history, and how does a city move forward and bring everybody into the vision for a thriving city. The current public process has been talking about what would happen on a particular site, and that is ultimately a question. But I think we all believe that for Richmond to move forward as a really inclusive community, that everybody needs to understand the story of the past, and that if you can't talk about it, it sort of just haunts you in a different way that doesn't allow you to thrive. And so to build the kind of trust and move forward, Richmond needs to have a bigger conversation about truth and reconciliation, about race and what has happened here and how to move forward before it can really dig into what should we do with this site. So we think ultimately that process will allow you to have a conversation about how to tell the story and memorialize the ground and redeem Shockoe Bottom, but it needs to be, in order for the city to reach its full potential, everybody has to share in the success of the city, and everybody has to have an understanding of the past and an ability to move into the future. So we think that this idea of a shared vision, it involves some more process, it involves a lot more conversation, but it will be an important part of your success going forward. So in an effort to kind of frame up where you go from here, we created this matrix, and we're going to deal with all of these categories as we go through our presentation. We're not going to fill in every box in here today, but the top outlines some values and some outcomes that we think can be accomplished by you in this, and some of that is about this idea of reconciliation and righting some wrongs and creating a more equitable system. Some of it is about protecting and honoring history, and we think you can also achieve equitable prosperity and health and wellness and a vibrant arts and culture scene, and that those are outcomes of this process that you'll see in Shockoe Bottom and that will ripple through the rest of the city as you begin to implement them. Along the vertical axis are some strategies and tools about how to get there, and that's what we're going to dig into next, is what are the tools, what are our recommendations, what do we think can happen to help achieve those outcomes across the top, and using the tools along the other axis. And so I'm going to invite my colleagues to come up and start to have a conversation with you about the public realm side of these tools and strategies.
Good morning. It feels so great to be back in Richmond among so many friends. So this morning we wanted to start this presentation talking about the public realm. What do we mean by public realm? Well, public realm is the public space that the community comes together to have the conversations, the easy conversations, and perhaps the deeper, more difficult, meaningful conversations as well. So in public realm, what we include is the connectivity, access, and the infrastructure. What do we mean by each one of them? Connectivity means the network of linkages, hopefully pedestrian and bike-friendly linkages that unite, bring together the neighborhood. Access. As we were interviewing some of your stakeholders, there was a young lady that told us that she and her husband have a home with their kids in Churchill, and that she's afraid to walk to the Shockoe Bottom area or even to the Shockoe Slip. That walk is just too difficult for them to.
Excuse me, could you speak into the microphone? We can't hear you in the back.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Is it better?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, as I was saying, as we met with your stakeholders, there was a young lady that told us the story that she and her husband own a property in Churchill, and they have kids, and that they are afraid, literally afraid, to walk from Churchill to the Shockoe Bottom or to the Shockoe Slip. So what we mean by access is the creation of safe walking, community-friendly pathways. And by the term infrastructure, what we mean is all the supporting infrastructure to support this vision. So, in order to deliver on this strategy, we thought we needed to create a vision. Not a vision for the whole project, because that really belongs to you all, belongs to the community, belongs to the elected officials, but a vision for the public realm. And so what we decided that would be was to create interconnected public realms in the city to promote reconciliation, the preservation of history, the celebration of diversity, healing, and resolve. And so we said, well, let's do a very detailed map showing all these interconnections. And they said, well, we really don't have enough information to do that detailed map. So we defaulted on doing a sketch. Sketch is always a way to disguise what you don't really know. So at the epicenter of our sketch, which we entitled Reconciliation Hub, and you will be hearing the theme of hub throughout this presentation often, at the epicenter we put the Shockoe Bottom. But in talking with many of you, we felt that the Shockoe Bottom needed to be connected. Connected to what? Well, connected, for instance, to the neighborhoods, connected to Churchill so that we can help this young lady walk with her family to downtown. It's obviously connected to the farmer's market, connected to the Shockoe Slip, perhaps also connected to the financial district. Obviously, it needs to be connected to the canal walk and riverfront. The canal walk and riverfront is already connected to the river, and why not also connect it to the south side through one of the bridges to get to the Manchester neighborhood. And there could be others. Obviously, this system can also be interconnected to the other existing trails. So this is the concept that we thought and developed, and you will see this theme recurring throughout the presentation of what we call the Reconciliation Hub. So with this, I'm going to ask Ashley.
Thank you. Revitalizing the site as a reconciliation hub, and to quote the mayor, as a gift to the city, resonated with us because the site started as a trading hub and it became a trading hub for human beings. Now it can serve as a hub to connect the many physical and emotional layers. This land is special, and there is a moral imperative propelling this project. Because there's so much history and emotion tied to the site, all of the public realm should be considered a site of conscience. A site of conscience is defined as a historic site, museum, or memory initiative that connects past struggles to today's movements for human rights. Utilizing the public space is a way to turn memory into action.
Thanks. So I think that the idea here is that we first need to start by actually providing a physical space to have this conversation, right? We need to locate ourselves within Shockoe Bottom. And then think about the connections as we've been talking about. So the sort of midterm actions are really about creating the public realm, connecting folks through the Shockoe Bottom and to Shockoe Bottom, connecting parks to one another and utilizing the public realm for both sort of social and environmental needs. So thinking about complete streets on these major corridors that can incorporate activated spaces that become economic drivers and also places of activity. And then thinking about the sort of long-term, large-scale connections that we really need to make. And that speaks to the greater kind of watershed, actually, area of the Shockoe Creek and the former connection, thinking about how we're actually going to help this site reconnect to its riverfront. That'll be a really important connection, as well as the sort of trails that are, growing and building, and really making those kind of the special place for Richmond.
Thanks. One more. Protecting the history in the public realm. So we heard in the interviews that the site should not be limited, it should be and do more. All of the public lands and connecting spaces should be considered a museum and interpretation space without walls. So much like the Box Brown Plaza, where Reproduction Box illustrates the box that Henry Brown built to ship himself on the Underground Railroad to freedom after his family was sold to a North Carolina plantation. Vibrant programming within the public realm brings value to the things around it. It forms the basis of cultural and heritage tourism. So here are our recommendations. I'm not going to read through them, but I do want to point out that it's essential until a shared vision is adopted that there needs to be protection of the archaeological resources because they are under the entire site.
So another piece of this is really about how to create this as a draw, an international and definitely national draw, this site. So that means, we take advantage, or you can take advantage of the cultural and historical heritage of this site and really think about, celebrate that so that it becomes a place for people to come and experience that, that history of America, but also becomes the economic driver that you hope for this neighborhood. So more immediately, the idea is that we're going to actually enhance the public realm with these types of improvements. So here are a couple examples. The Civil Rights Heritage Trail, where it becomes really a draw for everyone to understand that history. And this is in Birmingham, so it speaks to the 1963 movement, and you can actually march those same marches, really connecting people to the history of the place, but also connecting them to the city of Birmingham. And then another example recently is an artistic project in Montreal where folks have actually created a series of sites throughout the city and connect folks to those through art. And it connects them to the history of the place. So here we really want to use the public realm as a place to start that conversation, and then also encourage through kind of transit and streetscape improvements, creating a safe place for folks to come and connect. But ultimately, the sort of larger scale vision is that this is an economic driver, really, as the sort of cultural location for Richmond. And then finally, I think, you know, Richmond has a rich history and is already utilizing a lot of arts and culture, events, spaces, art. And so taking that and applying it to this site, really to reveal what has been a buried narrative for the city. And then working with, in the short term, sort of working with local artists and trying to develop more immediate artwork that is interpretive and educative, giving this place a space to have that conversation. And then long term, sort of thinking about an expanded footprint that really speaks to the idea of interpretation without walls. And there's a lot of work that's been done in this area, you know, on the Independent Film Festival, you know, the Richmond Mural Project. These are organizations that are already in place that can be, you know, leveraged to sort of engage this space and create somewhere that people want to visit now and throughout the future.
So they gave me this health and wellness slide because they probably think that I need more exercise. But in what do we mean by health and wellness? Well, let's take advantage of this connectivity of the public realm in order to create a system of trails and sidewalks that connect to the existing system that provides for, you know, I envision those trails and walks, you know, with pop-up clinics, with markets, with foods, with entertainment. You know, eventually I would envision it having festivals, exercise programs, races. In the long term, I think that we would like to hopefully see recurring events, festivals. So a space where the community comes to get that. Sorry. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to my colleagues.
I think the next group is development and land use.
Thank you. So development and land use. So the site that was given to the Rhodes Fellowship is approximately a 9-acre site, depicted here in yellow. It includes the Devil's Half Acre, the Lumpkins Jail, and the African Burial site. As mentioned earlier, there are some challenges with the site from development and land use. So the first is just the massive infrastructure presence here. So it creates kind of a physical and visual boundary that you have to deal with. The second is the future of high-speed rail and its impact on land use both today and into the future. The floodplain. The majority of the site is located in the floodplain, and it has to be dealt with in some capacity if there's going to be future development here. Next is zoning. Today there's a fragmented zoning at the site, so there's a variety of zoning classifications that negatively impact its development potential. And last, that it's been mentioned several times, there are a lot of visions for the site, but there needs to be one unified vision that can help guide development into the future. While these are several challenges, we think the site presents significant development opportunity both in the short term and the long term, and my colleague Dan is going to address a couple of those opportunities.
Thank you, Brent. So there are some opportunities definitely to the site. One of those that we've looked at, and this is related to the whole hub idea, is regarding kind of expanding the study area. So instead of looking at just the 9-acre kind of Lumpkin site and the burial ground, or looking at the Lovings parcels, looking at the whole thing as an interconnected kind of a series of neighborhoods and spaces. So expanding it up and in towards Churchill and to the kind of southeast, but also looking at its impacts on the communities to the west and to the north as well. So additionally, we look at there are these prospects of forming partnerships with vital stakeholders. So it's not only just VCU and the parking that's currently going on there, but it's also looking at health organizations like MCV, Reynolds Community College, and how do we leverage those partnerships with the development potential that is in this area. It's also a pretty significant opportunity to involve the development community in this vision planning for the district. We've heard about this whole idea that there is not a shared vision that we currently have. We have many people with lots of different visions. So bringing the development community into that entire conversation to make sure that there is this shared vision that is guiding that development through this area. And then the ability to address affordable and mixed income housing within what we're calling kind of this district or hub. As development comes in, increases in rents, increases in property values, there's a definite potential for displacement. So creating policies that lead to a more inclusive and kind of mixed income, mixed housing within this area. So what we have, this is related to the matrix that we've provided for you previously. These kind of strategies and tools. So for the immediate, which is about 0 to 2 years or so, we're looking at things such as establish a physical vision for the hub and district. This becomes a part of the greater vision and this unified vision to help provide that land use guidance that's needed for the new development. Develop design guidelines. The design guidelines, having that there to make sure that the scale of the development and everything is proper and speaks to the historic nature of where we're at. Making sure that we align the near-term investments in infrastructure and public realm, where we're standing here, the BRT that's coming in, and the farmers market and all of the significant public realm improvements that we've already done so far, and making sure that those are tied in with what we're doing. And then exploring a land acquisition strategy for some of those strategic parcels. Additionally, we suggest looking at economic impact study during this initial period, understand the impacts of those, identify protected areas for public realm improvements that celebrate the historic culture. Again, being sensitive to the historic areas and the goals of that community. And then that mixed-use housing strategy to make sure that we have an inclusive development that includes the neighborhoods to the east, that includes pretty much the whole Richmond community, instead of just them operating in a silo right here in this area. So once you provide that vision, that land use vision for this area, spurs the development and people can come in with additional land use strategies to help with that. So looking at land use tools such as maybe creating an overlay district or something of that sort. Rezoning select areas of the district, so going through and making sure that that zoning aligns with whatever type of development is seen within that unified vision. And then formally adopting those design guidelines within that time period to guide that development. And then beyond that, once you get that going, looking at the long term that you go through and you're protecting the integrity of the vision, and then updating it when needed to make sure that it continues to align with that vision through the future. So the values and outcomes from a lot of these policies, things of that sort, we're looking at reconciliation and equity, so inclusionary housing policies, expanding retail and commercial options for people that normally wouldn't be there. This could be addressing food deserts and things of that sort. Protecting history, so design guidelines and respecting the scale and character of the adjacent neighborhoods and making sure that all of these systems fit together. Equitable prosperity, creating those strategies as we talk about those partnerships, things with VCU, Virginia Union, Reynolds Community College, MCV, job training programs, not just having to construct, the jobs that are here for the construction for the 18 months while it's being built, but long-term strategies for jobs and for job development in the area. And then health and wellness, development to resolve food deserts, expanding farmers market, making sure those connections are tied to the community, and then making sure that we have those partnerships with the key institutions. So at that, I will ask that the education and economic opportunity people come up. Thank you.
So Brian and Christopher and I are going to talk a little bit about what we think are some of the opportunities as it relates to expanding opportunities for education and economic development in the area. And I'm going to talk about the education pieces of this, and there really are a couple of major ideas that we'd like for people to consider. And one of them is about having a school in this neighborhood. And we know that the mayor has an interest in improving the quality of education here. And this might be a wonderful place to demonstrate how that could happen, and to create a school that's focused on academic excellence and that is a hub of education for this whole area. It would be a school, we don't have a recommendation about exactly what the school should be, like what grades or anything like that. That's obviously something you all would have to figure out. What are the community needs? But, well, what's the right school to put in this neighborhood, and how can it be not just a school for whatever grades you identify, but a community education hub that brings in early childhood education and adult education and partnerships with other institutions like the colleges around town, so that it really becomes a hub for education in this area, and a source of opportunities for programming as well. So combined with that, another big idea that we'd like to consider, and we know that some of you will think this is complicated, and it might be complicated, but you have this beautiful building here, and we'd like to suggest that some part of the museum that you have envisioned for this area might actually happen in this space, and that it would connect with the outdoor museum that's more the outdoor living, walk-in, breathing space, but that this space here could become a launching place for people to learn about the history of this area and to access the other parts of the site. So those are kind of two big ideas in terms of having a school here and having the museum in this building, and creating connections between those two, developing curriculum that will flow back and forth between those. So an urban ag curriculum that might focus on working with the farmers market, curriculum around all kinds of community development issues, and lifelong learning opportunities for people. Another piece of it that we think could be really interesting is to figure out how to use technology to create an ancestral genealogy research center here that might be modeled after, or might learn from, the Salt Lake City model, where you can plug in information into a computer and access ancestral information here. So we think that that's something that could be developed over time. We think that there are lots of partnerships that can happen to make this work, and Christopher is going to talk about some of those.
Thank you, Colleen. How are you guys feeling? Good? All right, good. Just want to do a quick check-in. That was a good train out there. I think one of the things we learned over the last couple of days is that there's a lot of passion about making Richmond, one, and economically vibrant. And one of the things we also recognize that there are a lot of institutional players, whether it's the private sector, but also the universities, who have their own definition and vision of how to make that happen. And so one of the first things we as a group came together to suggest that there's clearly a need to create a comprehensive partnership when it comes to the economic development strategy in this area. Primarily, universities are already dedicating resources, acquiring space, making capital decisions throughout this region, which will have an impact on the type of jobs, what type of neighborhoods, and also the availability of future tax base for this community. And so one of the first things we believe should happen is that the city, along with the private interest and university institutions who are in this area, to come together to integrate their respected economic development strategies, as well as understand the needs that each of the stakeholders have, to make sure that you guys are not bumping into each other. And I think that's one of the issues that we believe you guys are going to have if you create this shared coordinated strategy. The second thing is we really also found that there's this rich local art community. And oftentimes when you think about art, we're thinking of essentially of something that people go to. But throughout the world, we're finding that art-related economic development is one that should be visited and thought about here. And that think about a local Richmond resident creating the next, Shockoe watch or bag or t-shirt that's being worn as a cultural identity across the world. And I think that is something that you guys have to, not just working with VCU, but also creating this space for the local residents. I think that's something you should try to take advantage of. Of course, one of the things that, with the train that's going by, there's a lot of infrastructure opportunities, with the conversation around the high-speed rail, as well as with the current site, there are opportunities to train local residents on green infrastructure, on high-speed rail construction, and those other services that are associated with that. Now is the time to start building those platforms and those partnerships with those institutions to start that pipeline. And now this is an example of just how, in New Orleans, how they actually aligned some of their arts criteria with the economic development strategy. So I'm not going to spend too much, but this is kind of an example of how other cities have approached this. Next, one of the things I was really keen in and honing on is the fact that, as I said before, there's a lot of interest and understanding that there's a lot of economic value at this site. And with that, there's a lot of questions about how do we take this shared vision that we just discussed, how do we take this now hub and accelerate the private investment, accelerate job creation, but do it in a way that actually enhances the cultural vibrancy, enhances the social equity in this place, but also help create the one Richmond story that you guys have been telling us about all day. So one of the first things I think most immediate is something that we saw during our research, that back in the 1800s, you guys cataloged all of the black-owned businesses. And actually, one of the data that we saw, you were actually able to click from like 1850 to 1875, and you actually saw this clear trend of increased black creation of businesses. Now, of course, as you can imagine, after Jim Crow, there were a lot of things that happened, so forth and so forth. The question here is that is something you should recapture as part of your history and actually make that your next goal, to be the highest creation of black-owned businesses. And one of the things we suggest that you identify where those businesses are, small and micro, and figure out ways to preserve and protect them and bring them to scale. Secondly, we also believe that there needs to be an immediate conversation about how to create opportunities in this neighborhood. And one, if you haven't been watching the news, one of the things that happened in the recent tax bill that was passed was that now governors are able to designate low-income census tracts to incentivize private investment that do equitable development, whether it's affordable housing, small business creation, and so forth. And so, Mayor, to you as a call, we really believe that you as a city should go and lobby your governor, because he has 30 more days to designate these places. And so you want to make sure that this location has the tax incentive in place to make sure that the developers and the investment community who wants to come here are doing it quickly, but actually the right way. And last but not least, we believe that you currently have a current asset, which is the tax abatement policy. Why not modify that particular program to also give incentive to protect cultural assets, as well as incentivize some of the affordable housing, mixed-use income that we discussed before. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you. Well done. What's your phone? Sure. All right. How you guys doing? Good. So this is a important topic for me. I am out of New Orleans, Louisiana. And for me, we've gone through a lot of this stuff over the last few years. Over the last 3 years, we worked on kind of taking down the monuments in our city, but over the last 60 years, we've actually worked on the larger systems that tie to those symbols. And so here, we're gonna talk about the community development, how that might work its way into the overall process of what you're doing here. I mentioned to our team, and I'll mention it to you as well, this is a tremendous opportunity to think about the ways in which truth and reconciliation can be brought to the city. You have a connection between South Africa and Liverpool here in this city through the monument of the statue that you brought here already. Use that as a means to kind of push some of those larger policies around development of self, of community, and of individuals to move forward. So the first thing I'll mention is that establishing an entity or a quasi-governmental agency, and I've been on both sides of this. I've worked for the city of New Orleans, and I've worked in private practice. So, but again, establishing a quasi-governmental agency that's responsible for assessing and prioritizing community benefits, specifically when you do projects like this that are intense, that are large, that have cultural significance. There's ways in which that starts to push people out of a space that they've been in for a long time. And so ultimately you want to make sure that you have the benefits wrapped around whatever project comes into this place to support those communities and those businesses. Once you establish those priorities and you start to look at the ways in which land can be captured, right? There's a land trust that can be considered based on the fact that those resources, when put into this place, will start to shift how the community operates. You can start to look at the existing resources and the uses that you have now. Specifically, we talked with Ellen about the arts kind of community here, and the opportunity there is fantastic. I used to run the Arts Council in New Orleans as the Place and Civic Design Director. One of the things that you have an opportunity to, that I see in you, is the ability to utilize those resources as a means to codify your history in place in the public realm, and use that as a means to kind of continue that story, as a means to tell the truth in place, and to, again, seek redemption and reconciliation. Again, creating a community investment fund, establishing small-scale developers. There's a project out of Milwaukee that considers neighborhood developers as a means to, again, to localize investment, to localize the resources of investment, to create a place that those who are the extant community can start to develop that asset, right? So that's an opportunity, again, that you have. And again, lastly, Newton's law, right? There's equal and opposite force. So when you are developing these spaces, you have to look at everybody it's going to impact. There are public housing very close to this space. What happens to those communities when this starts to revitalize itself? If you don't think about it now, you can't think about it at the end. It won't happen. So quickly, I'll give you just, you know, I usually wouldn't do this, but this is a few projects that I'll just show you that we have worked on in New Orleans because we have a very kind of formal connection. This is a project called the Claiborne Corridor, and ultimately is looking to do a very similar thing. It cut through an African-American neighborhood down the center of New Orleans, a highway, and we wanted to make sure that we brought back the 396 businesses that were eliminated through that space. This is ultimately a way for us to honor our ancestors and our elders by creating these votive lights that honored the history of place. So that's one way that you can start to think about this. From the other side of things, from the city side of things, Datafield, this is a project that talks about water use throughout the city of New Orleans. But it uses public art as an immediate way to bring into focus all the challenges and all of the opportunities that you have with your city. And the last one I'll show you, when it comes to talking about history, this is a project that we do. It's called Paper Monuments, and you can look and see how you can tell the story of your city, whatever that may look like, in as many different voices as you can muster, and bring it to the public. So I say that mostly because there are organizers in this room. Utilize every opportunity to work with your city, to organize and to put in place strategies that speak to this history in a significant and opportune way. So, thank you. Pass it off. Next. Governance.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Good morning, everyone. So, in order to achieve and really execute a lot of the recommendations that we just mentioned, it's important to have a component of governance in all of this. Governance is a fairly broad topic, and there have been a lot of elements and plans and strategies that the city has put in place that we want to acknowledge and recognize. And it's important that the city use that as a foundation to build and improve on creating an infrastructure, as we talked about, I think, for social and equitable inclusion, which has a key component that can be realized through a larger community engagement process. But as I mentioned, there's also a clear environment. There's an opportunity to realize all this through a range of recommendations that we're going to touch on a little bit further here. So 2 areas that we decided to focus under this topic of governance has to do with equity and inclusion, as well as, at the end of the day, there's a project that we've been tasked with to identify in this particular neighborhood and how to actually implement that. we felt as we talked over the last few days that there is a very strong lens that needs to be examined further, not only in this location, Shockoe Bottom, but also across the city. And it's a real opportunity to focus on equity and inclusion. And there are opportunities through fact-finding as part of the Rose Center to reach out to other cities to examine practices for embedding racial equity into government operations. Certainly there are a number of resources that are available that we're going to be talking about further. We do have a suggestion to the mayor and his administration to look at creating an Office of Equity and Inclusion to, again, build this lens into the day-to-day operations of government, as well as we've talked about, creating a larger vision, a shared vision that can be realized through stronger, I think, community engagement policies. In terms of implementing this larger solidified vision for Shockoe, we will talk about, we saw a clear need, I think, for a project manager, a day-to-day person who can actually take on a lot of these recommendations, who can work closely with the staff that we've been talking with all week long, as well as the mayor. We did look at, there was a 2011 Shockoe Economic Revitalization Strategy that some folks in this room worked on, and we believe that there are a number of strong recommendations in there that can certainly be brushed off. There may be a little dust on the report, but there's a lot of good material in there. And then possibly establishing an implementing entity. And I think there are already some structures that are in place in the city, and we'll talk through some options there.
So we're looking at an Office of Equity and Inclusion, not just as another level of bureaucracy. We understand that there's a lot of work that has to go into it. Your previous panelists have presented to you a ton of work, and this office can serve as a way to put the framework around this work. However, I want you to keep in mind that this is around dignity. I think many of your residents through our conversations and our interviews have expressed the fact and acknowledged that our governance structures and institutions have empowered, have given privilege and protection to a very small part of the population, and to the exclusion intentionally of others. So we have to acknowledge that. And in order to figure out how to include more people into these processes, you need a structure, and you need to figure out how to do that. So dignity is a piece of this. Secondly, when people begin to be included in these processes and policy-making decisions and development decisions, they begin to trust you and trust your work and what you are doing. And finally, the third thing I wanted to bring up is that the government is able to set an example for the rest of the city. This work should not be just solely done by the government, but it really is about other institutions rallying around this as well. So the government could start this work and really kind of set an example for businesses, nonprofits, your institutional partners like the universities and hospitals, because this work needs to be done by everybody and not just the mayor's office and government. So again, this is some very short-term activities that you can do now, because this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. This takes us some time. So looking at other cities that have been doing this work, Seattle, for example, has been doing this work around equity inclusion for about 20 years. So they're a really great resource. But you have resources very close to you. Fairfax County is trying to figure out how to embed equity and inclusion into their government activities. And then you've got neighbors to the south in Asheville and Raleigh. So these are like really quick trips. Day trips, week trips, you can invite them to do exchanges around this because they're working on this as well. There are other equity resources. So you have these institutions that are working on this nationally. And this is possibly looking at conferences to attend and fellowships to attend. They have webinars on their websites. You can hire a consultant. And I've been reminded that you should not hire an urban design consultant to do this work. While this particular project is about economic development, urban designers are not necessarily skilled at working around equity, because it's not just about development. This is about every institution in government, from public safety to public health, public works. So it's important that you look for somebody to give you guidance who has a specialty in this. This is not to say that you don't need somebody like a Brian Lee who works on justice in design to do planning or design work. But when you want to start your structure, look for people who are doing this across government. And just to reiterate, just public officials and the mayor, you're a choice architect. You impact people's lives, right? Their quality of life, their social mobility. So this is why this position, this actual office is important to the administration. Sorry, I'm gonna take a look at my notes real quick, because there's a lot here. The structure is also good because it eliminates bias in decision making. When you have a structure and when you have policies, you have to go through a process and a matrix to figure out, does this cause harm to people? Does this uplift people? And if you have a lens that you can clearly see that there's no bias in your policies and your programs, this office will serve as really a consultant for all of the departments that you're working in. And again, back to accountability and transparency and trust. You're gonna go through a planning process. You're gonna have an equity plan, whatever you wanna call it. You're gonna have goals, you're gonna have measures. Put this out to the public. Put this on the website so everybody can see. This holds you accountable. You become transparent in your processes. That also builds trust. And finally, we've heard a lot about the community engagement challenges around this project in particular. And Martine's gonna talk a little bit more about that in detail. But this project is larger than the neighborhood that it sits in. This is a national and even international project. And so while neighborhood projects stay in neighborhoods, this project is the entire city's project. And all residents should be a part of this process. I will tell you a personal story. When I found out the history of this property, and others in our group did as well, I called my mother. She's in Georgia, and I said, is it possible that our ancestors came through Richmond? People are going to be bringing their family members, people are going to be bringing their friends here. This is national and international work, and it takes everybody's effort. Anybody who wants to participate, it takes everybody to get this work done. And so your community engagement infrastructure needs to be in place to do that. So I'll hand it over to Martine.
No. All right. Thank you, Karen. So just doing a deeper dive in terms of community engagement, defining a community engagement. As we heard and as we've mentioned throughout this presentation, we heard through our conversations as we listened to folks that there were a lot of visions, there was a lot of interest in this site, and we just want to take a moment to talk about the difference between community outreach and community engagement. We know that a number of folks here certainly understand the difference and significance of this, but it's important to reiterate, and community engagement is key to not only solidifying the vision for Shockoe Bottom, but certainly I think for a vision as you all are going through your Richmond 300 process that will really drive, I think, clear outcomes for the city at the end of the day. I used to be the local redevelopment authority director for a project in Washington, D.C., and I will say the project that I worked on, the former Walter Reed Army Medical Center, the success of that development and that site had to do with clear expectations about community engagement, clear conversation that happened. There was a solid feedback loop that the city had to go back at certain points and say, okay, we need to revisit this and go back out to the community. And it was an ongoing conversation that built trust and accountability at the end of the day. And we think that that's key to realizing a solidified vision for Shockoe Bottom and certainly for the city as a whole. And along the way, and I have to mention this for Brian too, is organizing is key to that. And we met with a number of neighborhood groups, and we understand that there were some groups that weren't able to meet with us. But having a clear infrastructure to make sure that neighborhood groups, churches, other activists can stay involved and can stay a part of this process. So as I mentioned, one of the key short-term opportunities is, as we've talked at length, is solidifying this vision for the Shockoe hub, for the Shockoe neighborhood, and building on and acknowledging that there has been a number of outreach and engagement efforts, and there have been a number of concepts developed to date, but it is important to convene all those parties, and we'll talk through some homework later on that's going to touch on this a little bit further in terms of what can happen in the next few months. But we want to make sure that there's a process in place and something that can be done at this point to set those rules of engagement and to build on, I think, a larger community engagement process that the city can utilize, not only for Shockoe, but for the city as a whole. So coming back to this Office of Equity and Inclusion, we identified that there's an opportunity with this office, and it may be another office as the mayor and administration sees fit, but we need a process to define larger community engagement policies. As we touched on, the difference between community engagement, community outreach, community organizing, and really at the end of the day, define the rules of the road. What does it mean to have that feedback loop, to get those conversations in place, to have the accountability and to have the trust in the process, not only for projects that happen in Shockoe Bottom, but also across the city as a whole. And certainly, we touch on that, Karen touched on this, hiring a community engagement specialist, a firm who knows how to facilitate these conversations is crucial. When I worked for the city of Washington, D.C., it was critical in a lot of the conversations that we had because it helped, I think, make sure that people were heard, that they felt heard, that they could be documented, and that there was that conversation actually taking place. So now I'm going to hand it off to Mike to talk a little bit more about implementation and how all this can come together.
Good morning. We've talked a lot about a list of to-dos today. There's a lot in here. So how are we actually going to, or how are you all actually going to get this done? And that's my job here, is to give you some recommendations on some structure and some goals moving forward. It was really interesting as we talked to different people. We heard things like, please, no more process. We don't want any more process. We've processed this to death. And yet here we are, we keep talking about process. It's there, you've done a lot of the work. It needs to come together and it needs to be led. There needs to be leadership here to execute on that. In our discussions with many of you and with the people that we were able to interview and sit down and talk with over meals the last couple of days, we learned about a lot of different plans that are existing, and yet no one had really taken all those plans and created some kind of an overlay to see where there were some intersecting commonalities. They all just kind of existed on their own. We also learned that people were really craving a leader. They needed someone who could who shared the vision, who understood the historicity of the site, was able to pull groups together, have conversation, and listen to all sides, but yet remain committed to the vision and move things forward. Colleen mentioned the word earlier in our introduction. She used the word fatigue, and that was probably a word that many of you can relate to over this project. So we want to move beyond fatigue. We want to make this happen. We, meaning you all, want to make this happen. And so we're going to recommend some structure here that could do that. Initially, what we'd like to see is a project manager. And this project manager is someone, this is a very important role in all this. This has got to be somebody who understands all the issues, who has the ability to convene different parties around the table, everyone who may have an interest in this, and reach some consensus. Be able to draw out the most important parts of the development and then move that forward and create a vision. and part of that role too is, as we've talked about this project, another word that's come up is building that trust. And I think there is some distrust that has been created over the years. And this leader needs to have the ability to as they listen to these different voices, be a trusted person to make sure that all viewpoints are represented. And I think all of you also have to realize that not every single thing can happen that you want. And so coming together and reaching some kind of consensus is certainly a group effort. Initially, we recommend that this project manager reports to a chief administrative officer located in the mayor's office. A direct connection to the mayor is really important. This gives this person the ability to work cross-departmentally throughout the organization, but also with outside organizations. But the mayor needs, and the chief administrative officer need to be fully engaged with what the project manager is doing and be able to respond to pressing needs. Over time, we recommend that this position moves into the Office of Equity and Inclusion, because that in many ways is what's really driving this project. So once that is formed, once that office is formed, moving that project manager to there, still with the same kind of connection to the mayor. Okay, some short-term and mid-term objectives here. As I mentioned, they must have the expertise and ability to bring many people to the table and to implement an equitable development program, as has been discussed earlier. And as I mentioned too, working cross-departmentally is really important. As you look at this site, there are so many things. And as we walked around here, learning about what's underground, anywhere from 1.5 inches to 19 feet, I mean, there's some major infrastructure under this ground. There's also some planning efforts. There's also listening to different voices. There's talking about the history of the site, the equity, the inclusion. This is a big role for somebody. So it's going to be a very long job description. And I think it's going to be really important that whoever brings this person also understands this vision and where it goes, so they get the right person in. This project manager will also bring in the consultant, as was mentioned earlier, to assist with community engagement and really be able to discuss and see a vision that addresses the fabric and the historicity of the community. As Martine mentioned, we looked through the 2011 report, the Shockoe Economic Revitalization Strategy Report, which had some really good recommendations in there. A lot of this work has been done. It is 6 or 7 years old, so it needs some updating, but I think it's a good place to start. It even gives some list of infrastructure improvements that can be done in some projected budgets. So you've got a foundation, you've got some places to start. And so the project manager needs to use that as a basis to have these conversations. Also, the project manager needs to be able to activate or expand existing economic development resources. Some of these are there, and they just need to be used, they need to be focused. It comes back to developing a clear vision for this project, and then looking at these resources and see how they can best align. Perhaps that would involve creating a new special assessment district, or using an existing riverfront special assessment district, the EDA, or looking to a CDC to come in after this has taken root and has been nurtured and is ready to move out of the mayor's office into an external organization. Looking at a CDC perhaps to manage this project and do everything that the project manager was doing. We think this is something that really needs to be considered. Having an outside group does bring some objectivity. It also transcends political environments and can last through it. It helps make sure that vision doesn't change with those who are in office, but the good work that's been done at the beginning continues through. That organization does have some responsibilities. As you look at it, this is a group who can make sure this is a clean, safe environment through some property management, through programming, making sure that the site is well marketed and branded, that the message is clear, that people, as we've discussed, when they come here, understand the historic events, how this is a place that has defined in many ways this community and our country. And there's such an opportunity there, and this person has to be able to understand how to relate that message. Again, this group needs to be able to be the quarterback and make sure that all the resources and groups are at the table and moving forward. If we go, or if you all go to an outside organization, there needs to be a board that is representative of all interests and of all those who are impacted from the community. It needs to make sure that people who are involved with pushing and explaining the history of this site are at the table. It needs to involve those who are living in the community, as well as the developers or the community activists. Everyone needs to be at the table having this discussion. Through this, of course, accountability and transparency are key. And I think probably when many of you hear about organizations or third parties, or even government, I used to work for the government, we were often, like, oh, well, it's just not transparent, we don't really know what's going on. Full transparency and communication is key to make sure this project is successful. And this group also needs to make sure that they are able to enforce any community benefit agreements and commitments that were made. And that is critical, and I think that also goes to the point of making sure this is an organization that can move on even as political environments change. So that gives you some structure on perhaps how to move this forward. The last part of this now, I'll turn the time back over to Colleen and Andre, who are going to talk to you about some conclusions and give you your homework.
Thank you, Michael. As far as I'm concerned, we could have actually stopped our presentation after what Karen had to say. I think, quite frankly, she really, her voice really represented exactly how we felt as a panel, and certainly reflects on the things that we've heard over the last 3 days. So in conclusion, just summarizing a number of things that we've said and that you've heard, the idea of Richmond having this opportunity to really use this as a moment for reconciliation. And I have to say this selfishly speaking, while this is your story, this is your history, unearthing that, I really think it's our story. I want to take this back to Chicago. I want to take this back to my hometown of Milwaukee. We need to look to Richmond and others across the country. I think now, more importantly than ever, at any time, given the political climate that we're in right now, this is an opportunity for you to be the leaders in understanding how we can actually reconcile and deal with the past and use that as a way to go toward the future. The idea of a shared vision, you've heard a number of us say that time and time again. I'm saying it again, a shared vision for Shockoe Bottom. The idea of not only achieving your goals, but I think going back and starting to refine them, identify other goals. And the idea where these goals can actually be achieved where everyone wins. This is not just the mayor, this is just not the investors, the developers, not just the institutions, but also the community. How can everyone have a serious shared goals where everyone wins and everyone benefits moving forward? We talked about the idea of connectivity, physically connecting to Shockoe Bottom to unlock its potential, not only to deal with reconciliation, but to use this as an opportunity to establish trust. This is nothing new between city government and community, or even developers in the community, or even developers in the city. How can we actually use this story and really understanding and reconciling, what's happened in the past to move forward to establish a new sense of trust? And with that, not only understanding that, but how can we use this again as a way to actually unlock development opportunity for not only just this site, but again, the larger area. The story, as you well know, goes beyond just the site. Your story is throughout the city. Your story is down the street. Your story is through the station. How can we actually use that as an opportunity to start to deal with some of these other things that we know we're going to have to deal with? If the development potential really happens and really goes forward the way we think that it can, how can you actually use this and leverage this to deal with some other things that deal with, to actually talk about inclusive and equitable development? There are a number of public housing sites that are just on the edge. How can we actually bring, that population into the fold to really start to satisfy and address some of their needs to bring them into the success of the future of the city? Main Street Station, here we are. Here is this space. We really think there's an opportunity to really deal with some near-term goals of actually having a museum located in this station. This is one of the gateways you have coming in for people coming in from the outside, the train. This should be part of their experience. They should know about Richmond's history. It should be one of the first things that people experience. A number of our ancestors had a different experience coming through. Now this is the time to actually share that story with other visitors. They actually see this experience and go through this experience as they come into your city. The idea of education, again, we talked about this not just from an institution standpoint, but really education for the next generation. How are we actually going to establish a school system that really builds upon the spirit that you have in your city and establishes that, you know, kind of learning experience that actually is going to keep the talent that you have here, nurture that talent here for that next generation. And there's been a lot of talk that was covered earlier about the city manager, or the idea of having a manager of city government, one who not only reports to the mayor, so the mayor can say, this is your job, this is what you're owning, someone who actually can interact with other government agencies, but more importantly, someone who can interact with the community, have their pulse on the community, someone that the community knows that they can go to, and things will get elevated to their proper places and voices within city government and also in the private sector. Then the idea of an inclusive table of representatives, a series of champions. This just cannot be one person. This just cannot be the mayor. This just cannot be VCU. This just cannot be the developers. And it just can't be the community. There needs to be a round table of champions, if you will, to carry this vision forward. And how do you actually tie this into your Richmond 30 plan? And also how do you tie it into the previous plans that you've already done? There's been a lot of good work here, but also it's going to take time. This is not going to be a 12-month effort. This is not going to be a 2-year effort. This is a 10 to 15-year vision, and also trying to understand where Richmond is going to be, where Shockoe Bottom is going to be in 2028 and 2030. And with that, Colleen, homework time.
Okay, we're almost done, you guys. We've talked a lot about all of these different elements of pieces of a vision that can come together here, and we're very excited for you to be able to get going on all of that. But when you listen to a long list like that, you start to wonder, where do we even start? Your team at the city here has been hard at work this week, and they probably don't want a homework assignment right this second. They have done a magnificent job of showing us around and helping us get the lay of the land. But this is not a week-long process. This is a year-long process. And so the next steps are for us to get together again in Detroit in a few months, and between now and then there are a few things that we would like to suggest that the city try to tackle. One of those is to hire or to designate this full-time person that would sort of live and breathe the idea of this vision for Shockoe Bottom, and to try to make that happen. There are a couple of steps in there, but even on an interim basis, having somebody who starts to move this forward every day of the week. Another thing that we think is an important step is to synthesize all the existing plans and concepts and proposals, and to figure out what are the common themes and where are there conflicts in that, and to sort out what you've already done in that regard, and begin to piece together this idea of a shared vision. We think that you should also research some examples of this truth and reconciliation process. It's been done in other places, and what does that look like, and how do you begin to take a look at all of the ramifications of the past and figure out how to move forward in a way that includes everybody. And there are community people and private sector people and institutions that can help you move through that process. Another thing that we think you ought to really consider is creating sort of an archaeological do no harm policy, so that nothing gets messed up before you have the big plan for what is going to happen next. And it's really hard because everybody wants something to happen quick, but there is a need to have a plan and have a vision and have the community engaged in all of that, and to not damage anything in the interim. And so as you think about how to move forward with some of this process, also how do you preserve some of the history of the site so it doesn't get damaged in the process. In addition, we think that you need to start to develop a really inclusive community engagement strategy that begins to broaden beyond the folks who have participated to date, and really think through how do you get a true shared vision in the city for what Shockoe Bottom can be. And then we think that you're gonna find that you have lots of folks that are interested in helping you fund this work, and that there are funding partners that will help you in this initial planning stage, and there are other people that will help you more when you're ready to implement some of the firm pieces of the vision. So we think that you should begin conversations with some of those folks in this interim period so we can think about what those resources are. We've sort of alluded to this before. We've had lots of interviews, we've had lots of conversations, we've had lots of dinners. We appreciate all of you who have helped to make this happen. The mayor and Dr. Newbill and Bob and Jane and Ellen, wherever she is back there, your city people have worked really hard to make this as productive and important a conversation as we could have here. So we really appreciate all of their hard work and their efforts to identify all the other people that we were going to talk to while we're here. So there's been lots and lots of folks who have helped make this happen. We appreciate all of that, and we're looking forward to seeing where we can take this over the next next months with us involved. But this is, as Karen said, a marathon, not a sprint, and it's going to take lots of years to implement all the pieces of this. So thanks for having us here today.